Van's, who of course were the godfathers of this community and remade the face of Cleveland. As the title says, by introduction, let me explain how I ever got to be, shall we say, one of the 3 or 4 experts on the Van Sweringens. One of them is now dead, so this tells you something perhaps, but how did that happen? When I was a child, I remember 2 things, and it was that my father said in the 1950s. And I think because my father was a country boy who made good, he identified with the Vans because they were country boys who made good. And so he identified with them from his own heritage. So he said 2 things. One thing he always said is the Vans were the only ones who had a vision for this city. The others never did. And ironically, that's repeated in a book, Crooked River Burning, by Mark Weingartner. He makes that point when talking about the Vans in a sort of historical novel about Cleveland in 45 through 65. The other thing that he always used to talk about, and I think this probably hit me and I remembered it because it seemed odd to me. You know, he said, when I bought this house, they told me I could not sell it without their permission. This is the so-called Van Sweringen consent that went into force in 1927 and was actually a highly unique form of control over property at the time. But we will talk about that a little later on as we pick up the story. So we have the building of Shaker Heights. Now who are these guys? I said they're country boys. They're born in a place called Rogues Hollow, believe it or not. A small, probably an apocryphal name, is down in the center of the state, and they are then only known as Sweringen. Now there's a guy named Gerrit Van Sweringen who came to the United States in the 17th century, and everyone who is named Sweringen, Van Sweringen, E-R or E-A-R, are descended from Gerrit Van Sweringen. And so these guys along the way drop the Dutch bit with the Van and become Sweringen. Now their parents have 5 children. The mother dies relatively young. And the father is a Civil War veteran who sort of never makes good. After the mother dies, they go to Cleveland. And all of them go there, including their 3 older siblings. Herbert is the eldest. He's the only one who married and had children. The other 4, O.P., M.J., and the sisters, never married. And Edith and Carrie were your classic old maids. They really became the mothers to O.P. and M.J. because of the age difference. And in those days, you didn't have welfare states, you didn't have anything, so if Mama died early, the eldest girls got to be mother. It's just the way that world was. So they come to Cleveland after the mother dies, and they end their formal education at 8th grade. This is right out of all the Horatio Alger stories. Nothing fancy here. There's no Harvard, there's no Andover, there's no nothing. Now, they go through the period where they do all the things that people say they did, and we have to assume that some of it's probably true. They were paper boys. They went to school with this, and they did that, and they worked very hard and were inventive. And I think that's probably true, that they were creative and inventive, and wanted to use that beautiful American expression, make good. So what we need to talk about some things that happened before that would ultimately shape what they did here. There is a thing called the Garden City movement, which was a big kind of philosophy of how cities should be organized at the end of the 19th century. And there was this gentleman, Sir Ebenezer Howard, who was sort of the theorist for the garden school. And the garden idea was that you created this central city that's connected outward by rail to smaller rings of cities. That was the ideal of it. The other thing that you also have at this time, in the 19th century, there were a lot of these utopian communities, of which the Shakers founded at least 20. And the Shakers, most of you, if you live here, you know the story. The reason they're called the Shakers, because in their dance and their religious services, they shaked or went back and forth. And so they get called the Shakers. The official name is a real mouthful. The United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Coming. All they really needed was a cable channel back then, but of course that didn't work. They'd have 2 million members today if they'd had a cable channel. All right, so they have 20 of these settlements in the U.S. And they set one up in what out here, over where you have Green Lake, Marshall Lake, Horseshoe Lake, and that area was sort of the center of where their original colony was. But as everybody probably knows, the Shakers had an unusual belief. Celibacy. Well, celibacy doesn't have much of a future unless you're a monk. And therefore, this society doesn't thrive. And by 1880, they're pretty much died out. And the remainder of them sell the property to a Buffalo syndicate that has these ambitions of developing it. Well, they don't go very far with it either. But let's go back here. I just want to mention the idea of a garden city is very important, and these are two important practical names. And at the end of the 19th century, Gertrude Jekyll was the leading landscape architect in the UK at the end of the 19th century. And she had a young protege named Sir Edwin Lutyens, who became Britain's leading architect in the 20th century. And his work is really quite important. Jekyll knew somebody named Sir Reginald McKenna. Reginald McKenna was the chairman of the Midland Bank, which was the largest bank in England at the time, if not the world then. And he designed 2 houses thanks to Gertrude Jekyll. He designs these houses for Reginald McKenna. And from that he gets work to design buildings for the Midland Bank. So there's several head offices of the Midland Bank, including its main office in London, across from the Bank of England, that is a Sir Edwin Lutyens building. He also designed the Viceroy's residence in India, the British ambassador's residence on Massachusetts Avenue. So he's very important in the first half of the 20th century in British architecture. This is a classic house that the two of them did together. This captures the whole idea, the idealized garden movement house. You have this English-style residence, garden all laid out, and they did this together, say, 1900. Now, this is the interesting thing. Look at the shape of the house. Now, one thing you learn, I forget how it was put, but when you deal with classical architects, they are without doubt the biggest plagiarists in the world, because they all copy. All right, and I'm not saying that critically, because I admit to being a mossback in my architectural preferences. I prefer classical form. So you don't get any of the unique stuff that you get with modern, but they all steal from each other and copy, and you will see a lot of that today. Now this is the home of Mr. and Mrs. Mark Grossman, built in 1926 and designed by Mead and Hamilton. And at that time, say World War I, Mead and Hamilton are among the 3 or 4 most important architects in Cleveland. There's a lot of, I call Shaker Heights has kind of like 3 architectural periods. And the first period, say 1910 to about 1925, is the Mead and Hamilton period, where you get these big fortress-type houses. Well, there's about half a dozen of them on South Park Boulevard, 3 of them built for the Grosselli family, around 1915 or so. So this is the house. Now, what do you notice? You'll see in a minute, there's 2 arches, and then you have the pillars, of chimneys rather. And of course, the gardens in this period are very mature. Maybe the trees need a little trimming so you can see the house better. Well, I got hold of Mr. Grossman's granddaughter in California, and she gave me this. That's the house in 1930, and that's her mother, Marcia Kahn Grossman, who later moved to California. Mark Grossman and his wife lived in this house for 50 years. He was a prominent attorney in Cleveland, very active in the support of the Jewish charities. He chaired a committee on housing in Cleveland in 1946. His wife was a gerontologist. I don't think anybody in 1925 actually knew what a gerontologist was, but that's what she did in her career. So that's their daughter with a dog outside the house. And if you think of the house, the Lutyens Jekyll combo, taking a look at the lines, it's copied. You know, Mead and Hamilton didn't do this because somebody had an inspiration one day. They obviously shopped. This is the interior of the living room in 1925-30. Okay? It's a magnificent house if you've ever been in it. I happen to have been in it once after the Grossmans died for a house sale. A beautiful paneling, great house. She told me a funny story. She said that during the Second World War, her grandmother had a young German who was living with them, I assume a Jewish refugee, who was staying with them. And so the two of them went out on the Shaker Lake behind the house, I guess Green Lake, and they're on a canoe. Well, it flips over. Now what happens? Well, this guy who doesn't really know that Green Lake is maybe 3 feet deep on a bright sunny day, he swims to the shore. Mrs. Grossman stands up, grabs the canoe, and walks in. Now, how do you get people to live out here in the middle of nowhere in 1910? Because, you know, this is 6, 7, 8 miles from downtown Cleveland. There is no rapid transit here. There's no streetcars. And wouldn't I rather live in Wade Park if I had money? Or maybe up at the top of Cedar Hill. But I don't want to live. Why would I live there? So these guys are confronted with a challenge. So they need, if you're going to make this work, you've got to come up with fast transportation. So what we find they do is that they got involved in developing Fairmount Boulevard in Cleveland Heights, I say 1905, 1910, and they convinced the Cleveland Railway Company to extend the streetcar lines out Fairmount to South Taylor, originally. At that time, the streetcars came up Cedar Hill, and they went up Cedar, and then they took a divergence over to Euclid Heights Boulevard, and I think they connected up onto Mayfield, and from there. So the Vans have this idea, hey, we want to build this curvy street with a median strip with streetcars and build houses that will off of there. So that's how we get Fairmount Boulevard, and if you look at it, it's a miniature Shaker Heights. Now, we want to do something more than that. We think there's this property over in Shaker Heights that we'd like to get. Well, of course, what they had to do actually was get Shaker Heights out of Cleveland Heights. So around 1911, there was a referendum where the 500 people who theoretically lived in Shaker Heights then voted to leave Cleveland Heights. So this is a very important thing to know. The Vans are into control, okay? These guys are very visionary. They're very good at hiring people, as we will see. But control is critical. We do not wish to deal with the masses and have them tell us what to do. Okay? We want to control. So they borrow money, get options on the property in Shaker, and start to see what they can do. Now you're immediately confronted with this problem. How are we going to get people there? Well, let's call the Cleveland Railway Company. And they convinced the Cleveland Railway Company, hey, you know that line you have on Fairmount? Yeah. Why don't we take it over Coventry and go out Shaker Boulevard to this street we're going to build called Cortlandt and run over Cortlandt where we have a country club. And you can do a loop there and come back downtown. And it will only take you 1 hour and 20 minutes to get to Shaker Heights. Well, that was better than walking. And so that actually sort of helped, because if you look at houses built after, there's a lot of houses that are off of Shaker Boulevard in the period built, say, 1910 to about 1916, and it starts to fill out. Okay, you start to see a lot of houses in that period, below, below Lee Road. But you see, they know, this isn't good enough. We're going to get there fast enough. We got to do something. And one day, looking at the map, they realized that just south of Shaker Heights, there was this thing called Kingsbury Run. So if you go to Shaker Square, you notice how there's this run down. And then and you eventually end up about 79th Street. And they said, well, we can get control of that. Nobody wants that little gully, so let's buy that. But how do we get downtown? Events, dear people, events. Why? Because what happens is in 1914, Woodrow Wilson is president, and he's a so-called progressive. And railroads are big, bad, and dirty, and we want to have antitrust laws. And under the Clayton Act, the New York Central Railroad, which owned the nickel plate, was mandated to sell the nickel plate. And this is the key thing that really becomes why the story is so important. In about 1913, they met one Alfred Smith, who was the president of the New York Central Railway, and had a sister who had some property out here, and she was going to sell it to the Vans. And he met them, and he was impressed with them. They hear that the nickel plate is for sale, and they want to buy the nickel plate. Because with the nickel plate, they get the right-of-ways they need to go downtown, to get past 79th Street, to get as far as 34th Street. And at 34th Street, you went up a ramp until they built the terminal that took you then down to Public Square. And so by 1920, they had what they needed to have Van Aken Boulevard or Southmoreland, Shaker Boulevard, down to the Moreland Circle and then downtown and up to the square. Then, but you got to buy this bloody railroad. And the Van Sweringens never had 8.5 million pennies, much less $8.5 million. So what do you do? Okay, well, first thing you get the money, and as it says here, the rapid transit is finished by 1920, and the service now is 25 minutes versus more than an hour via Fairmount Boulevard. Now this is a kind of an important slide for those of you who are financially oriented, because this basically lays down the essence of how they did all their financing. You establish this company, in this case, Nickel Plate Security Corporation. They come up with $8.5 million by doing this. They borrow $2 million from the Guardian Trust Company, and they have 6 notes equal to $6.5 million that they have to pay off over a 10-year period. Well, okay, we got breathing room. We've paid them the $8.5 million on paper. They actually owe the notes to the New York Central, and the New York Central, I'm sure, is not happy to wait till 1931 to get all their money back. So please, what are you going to do? What they do is they issue $2 million of voting preferred stock and $1 million to the public. I'm sorry, non-voting. I really misspoke there, and that's important. If you were an investor, an outside investor with the Vans, you got non-voting preferred, meaning you had 0 rights. You got a dividend, and they had the common stock with all the voting control. So remember what I said about being controlniks. That gave them control. So they borrow $2 million in this stock. They borrow, and then they take that money and pay off other debts they've got, and over time start paying off the New York Central, but they end up with full control through an ultimate holding company called Van Ness. Now sometimes people will ask, how did the Vans do all this? People were impressed with them. Alfred Smith of New York Central thought they were sharp guys. They trusted them. But the key names on there owned each 10%. And they are both very important names in Cleveland at that time. The one is J.R. Nutt, who was ultimately chairman of the Union Trust Company, and the other was Charles Bradley. They are directors, along with O.P. and M.J. of the Van Ness Company, and they control 20%. That's their reward. Now, who is Charles Bradley? The Bradleys were an important family in Cleveland. They had done a lot in property. And Charles Bradley's brother is Alva Bradley, who used to own the Cleveland Indians way back when. And his sister Helen Bradley was married to Malcolm Vilas. And the Vilases are one of these many families in Cleveland that are a slice of Standard Oil. Okay? You got a lot of families in Cleveland that have that heritage. And the Vilases were a slice of Standard Oil. I still can remember old Mr. and Mrs. Vilas in their 80s coming into church. And she'd hobble along. She could hardly walk, the poor thing. But that's a separate story. Anyway, That gave them connections, because being connected to Bradley and J.R. Nutt gave them connections to the best echelons of Cleveland socially and financially. Now, the Vans were never society people. They may have been in all kinds of social directories, but they never participated in any of the big events. A, they weren't married, B, they didn't have any children, etc., etc. So they were interested in, they were network guys, is what you'd call it today. They needed a network. These two characters are important to them for their Cleveland network. So where are we? The 1920s, of course, is a period of huge economic growth. The population of Shaker Heights goes from 1,600 to 18,000 people. About half of the houses in Shaker Heights are actually built before 1930, and everything else is after 1930. The terminal tower is finally finished in 1929 and 30, and this gives you the direct connection into downtown Cleveland. Okay? And an important thing to note is it costs more than Rockefeller Center.
Wow.
It's a project in scope equal to Rockefeller Center. It costs significantly more, and by the way, those are $1930, not today. Multiply that by about a factor of 30 to figure out what that would cost. One of the factors in why the terminal tower costs a lot more than Rockefeller Center is one simple word, and anyone who knows Cleveland is bedrock. In New York City, you can go down about 30 feet and you hit granite. And you can start building anything you want. In Cleveland, to hit bedrock in downtown Cleveland, you have to go 150 to 200 feet to get there. And in 1929, they didn't have pile drivers. So there's about 50 pilings in that structure that are dug out by hand and then filled with concrete. And, true to the story, there are a couple of guys buried in one of those pilings, sadly. There it is. This is one of several etchings. It was done by a guy named Rosenberg, who did these etchings. I think he got paid like about $5,000 to do them. And then they published them and gave them as gifts to people. And this one is of the terminal complex. You see the tower, and then you see what that used to be where Republic Steel was. But originally they were the Midland building, the Guildhall building, and the construction, the building, it's a building where they used to have a house in it. And I'm having a mental block on what they called it. I'm sorry about that. But there were these three buildings: Midland Bank for the bank, the Guardian building, the Medical Arts building, and the Guardian building, which they used for a lot of commercial developers were in there, including the Cleveland Builders Exchange.
Greenbrier Suite.
Yeah, well, that's in the tower, of course. Yeah. Now, this one is the one that's important to us, because this is the underpass through which the Shaker Heights Rapid Transit goes back then, and this gives you an idea of everything had to be dug out, and the way from an engineering point of view, by comparison to today, the scope of this sort of thing. There's the steam shovels and digging down and so forth, and here you're just coming into the terminal, roughly from where Higbee's used to be. Now, this I always find a fascinating slide. This is for building permits at the time. And you see what they did from 1920 to 1965. The peak here is 1927, the height of Coolidge prosperity. Now, an important thing was, three things were big parts of economic growth of the 1920s. This was called high technology. One was called refrigerators, one was called radios, and the third was called automobiles. And there are still houses in Shaker Heights built, say, before 1922 that used to have a place for the iceman to put in the ice for your icebox. After 1922, the city is fully electrified. Refrigerators now become more common, and we don't see that anymore. That stops. But the key thing here is to look at 1927 and 1925. Those are the peak years, the peak of Coolidge prosperity. And then you go to 1933. The Depression, 38 houses. Then we get a bit of a pickup in the Roosevelt years, And 1940 is 263 permits because now we're building to prepare for the war. A lot of defense contract work is being done, and unemployment is coming down. The country fell back into a minor recession again in 1938, called the so-called Roosevelt recession, and unemployment went up to its 20% levels again. Very, very unstable period in terms of what was going on. And then, of course, after the war, I love 1955. My older brother used to say, my parents, as we'll see shortly, moved to Shaker Heights in 1928. My brother was born in 32. And he once told me that, he said, you know, the most interesting period in my life was right after the Second World War. And I sort of said, why? He said, because for the 13 years of my life, nothing happened. There was nothing built. You know, there were no houses, there was a war, and nobody got new cars. So you have this nothing happen, and then the war comes, and then the war is over, and suddenly everything takes off. And you have this building, 48, 103, 52, 210, 1958, 105, and then of course we're past peak building, and we're built out by the mid-60s. Look at 1944, nothing's built during the war. That's an interesting year though, because one architect designed about 2/3 of the houses, and they're all two-family houses in Moreland on Westbury.
Sure.
And George Burroughs is the architect, yes.
When was the income tax?
When was income tax?
Yeah.
I mean, when did we get income tax? 1913.
Oh, okay.
But income tax, well, I'll just digress a second. Income tax in 1913 was 3%, and you had to make more than, $100,000 a year or something. But income tax with the First World War went to 70%. Because there was just huge borrowing needed to prepare for the
Yeah,
war.
I just thought it impacted.
Yeah. Well, and then in the 20s, you get what Andrew Mellon called scientific taxation, which now they call supply side. And the income tax rates come down from 21 to 1929, and by 1929, the highest tax rate is like 25%, versus having been 70% in 1919 because of the First World War. And then with Hoover in 1931, the income tax rate goes up to 60%. And with Roosevelt in 37, it goes up to about 90%. Yeah.
Something very interesting, you touched on it, and Bernanke was a student. Bernanke really kept us from the Great Recession becoming Great Depression.
Right.
I'm just talking,
Yes.
back in 2008. And he had said that they thought they were coming out of recession, so Roosevelt let even though there was a Fed, I guess he had control over everything, as a control freak, he let interest rates go up. And in 1937, and that's what caused the second recession.
That is a factor.
Which was not so minor, actually. And as a result, the reason that we have had an unprecedented boom is because Bernanke and his successors have been very mindful of the mistake that FDR made by permitting interest rates to go up, and that's why the interest rates have stayed so historically low, and that's why we're getting, even with a week ago, a kind of insurance clause reduction.
Well, let me go back and speak as a historian and forget current events. One of the
But
things...
it all ties in.
No, it does. But
we
in terms,
learned from what happened in the 30s.
But what's more important to what you said, two things. The Fed did not intervene in the Hoover years because the country was on the gold standard. And every time they thought about they were so concerned that the dollar would weaken if they did anything to cut interest rates, because it would cause a gold outflow from the United States. And in those days, gold was $20 an ounce compared to whatever it is now. In those days also, the Secretary of the Treasury was a voting member of the Federal Reserve. That changes in 1936. So we get the current structure where you have 7 members, and the Secretary of the Treasury is not a member of the Federal Reserve. And Bernanke always said, because interest rates were high from 29 to 33, and the Fed could not intervene legally the way they do now, the banks started to fall apart, and this massive deflation came in on top of what was a temporary market sell-off in 29. But that gives you a good question and a good background for the story. Now, let's just talk now about the physical structure of Shaker Heights. I call this the bones. What are the things that are critical to what you know? I'm sorry. You have two main arteries from Shaker Square, originally South Moreland, now Van Aken. You have Shaker Boulevard, the Shaker Lakes, the Shaker Country Club. You have 9 communities built around the public school. The 9th school, Mercer, was built after the Second World War, but in the Van's time there were 8 public schools. There was 1 junior high, Woodbury, and then after the war, Byron. And you have those schools and those districts are very important. And something else that's important are the deed restrictions and the standards in them. Okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a second. Here's Moreland, or what Moreland Circle becomes Shaker Square. Now, this is where we introduce 2 guys, Small and Rowley. They are very important to Van Sweringen's standards between 1921 and 1937, because they really reshape what the Vans considered acceptable aesthetically. All right? So, here's Shaker Square. Now, you'll notice you got a big building in the middle on 4 quadrants, bigger building in the middle, 2 smaller ones, kind of shaped like that. This is totally stolen from the Amalienborg Palace in Copenhagen.
There isn't, because they're 4 separate buildings.
Well, yeah, but that's the point. There's 4 buildings. They all repeat around a square through which traffic has access. See, that's where when you see an overhead of Amalienborg Square in Copenhagen, these 4 palaces built like this, again, not an original idea. It doesn't have it has a Georgian facade to it, but it's essentially in Copenhagen. And here, this used to be the Guardian Trust Company. This would be the main building, and then they always had the 2 smaller buildings on the outside. This is the Moreland Courts. Now, Moreland Courts was an interesting structure. This is every banker's worst nightmare. The developer goes broke. There was a guy named Josiah Kirby who was a bit of a con artist, and he goes broke in 1924. And he owned a mortgage company called the Cleveland Discount Company. And I remember my mother told me her father invested with the Cleveland Discount Company. This was a way for small investors to invest in mortgages. But his stuff all went south, and so did Cleveland Discount, and he went to jail. So this building that you see on the left, this in 1924 is half empty, half finished. And any of you who have ever been in development or banking will know that your worst nightmare is the developer went broke before the thing was finished. Now it's yours. Well, so this is Frederick Harris that designed this. And the Vans have to step in because they can't have this property going south. So they take over. And Small and Rowley are given the task, finish it. There was a big debate. We got to finish it. Maybe we could put a lot of efficiency apartments in there, and it would be more attractive to rent. There's a guy named Ben Jenks who's very important to the actual day-to-day operations of the Van Sweringen Realty Company that did the day-to-day operations of Shaker Heights. He said, we can't have efficiencies. There's these rich guys in Cleveland that keep their mistresses in efficiency apartments. I'm giving you what was the honest-to-God's understanding. So every one of these buildings, every one of these apartments has to have a fireplace and a dining room. None of these fast ladies are going to be in there. So that's how we get this. And these pictures were actually taken in the 1970s. So if you know the building today, the trees that were there then are now gone. That's the end building, or point building. That's a 1928 building, because Small and Rowley then decided to extend the building. And there's 10 apartments, 2 on each floor, and you get a library, dining room, living room, 3 bedrooms for your family, a butler's pantry, kitchen, 2 maids' rooms, and a couple of bathrooms. 30, Shaker Boulevard in Coventry. And I was in one once as a kid, and we were in the dining room, and suddenly I noticed there was something under the table, and I started hitting it. Well, the maid comes in. What do you need? And of course, you know, I had to raise my hand. I don't know anything. I just saw that thing and thought it would be fun to hit. And oh, by the way, the library, the living room, and the dining room have a fireplace. So, I mean, you know, this is pure Sutton Place material. This is really the best end of the building. Here are the trees. I mean, this is classic Van Sweringen. Let's have lots of trees. Let's make this very attractive. Okay? And then, of course, the building is actually 3 different types of architecture. You have Georgian, you have Gothic or English Renaissance, and then you have English Tudor. So you have 3 different styles of architecture incorporated into this building. Schools. I happened to choose this one because my family lived in Fernway. But like this school here, they're fortresses. You know, they overbuilt, you know. And remember that the developers, the Vans controlled everything. So they decided where your church was going to go, where the city hall was going to go, where the schools were going to be. You name it, they decided. The fairest way to say this is that probably no 2 men in the 20th century ever had as much control over the development of land as they did. Nobody. No developer in New York City, Donald Trump, forget it. These guys are small timers compared to the control that they exercise. They are more akin to, I like to think of Napoleon III rebuilding Paris in the 1850s, or what they did in Vienna. Likewise, when they rebuilt everything around the Ringstrasse in the later years of Franz Joseph. That's the kind of control you're talking about. So here you have this building, and of course this is before the fire. And of course they're going to rebuild it as much as they can to look exactly like this. Because like this, there's fortresses. I mean, look what they did with this school. When I walked in here, I'd never been in here before, because I haven't lived here in 40 years. And I looked at this building and said, oh my God, look at this, what they did with this. You know, whereas most places, they wouldn't have been able to do it, because the Vans always did everything double. They never did anything by half measures. There's nothing ever cheap or done by them.
When was there a fire at Fernway?
Fire was at Fernway last summer. It's the classic story. A roof was being repaired. Do I have to tell you more? If you ever want to know the horror stories of classic buildings, let's get the roof repaired. I guarantee you the roofers will make a strong effort to burn it down. Because I could give you a half a dozen classic buildings that the roofers did the place in, including Windsor Castle. Now you get, see, this is what they do. They also then acquire or give land to encourage Hathaway Brown, University School, and Laurel to come to Shaker Heights. We want the elite here. Okay, and they promote that aggressively. University School, again, Walker and Weeks. Walker and Weeks are big, usually in institutional architecture. They're not too much on houses, except a few really major ones. A lot of institutional work they did. Now we get to churches. Now this is almost cookie cutter. One day when I was putting this together a couple years ago, I looked at this and I said, my God, these things all look alike. And I should have thrown in Eastview Congregational, because it too looks like this. There's this village, I think it's New Thane, Vermont, where there's 3 churches on one square, and they all look alike. This is typical New England. So you got Plymouth Church, 1916, 1917. The Van Sweringen sisters went there, and the Vans basically gave the land for that, encouraged its construction. But St. Dominic's in the middle, which is 1945, and then you have First Unitarian, which is 1956. And you know, you could sort of say, as I said, Eastview Congregational is certainly like this, and to some extent Christ Church, which is built in the mid-50s after a fire, likewise has this same feeling. But these 3 are almost cookie cutter, pure New England. This is the idealized version of what we want. The Shaker Heights Country Club, this is first designed by Mead and Hamilton, say circa 1913, but then Small and Rowley come along. And Small and Rowley start redoing things that they don't think are right. Okay, so this gets redone by Small and Rowley in 1924, and you can debate whether it was an improvement or not, but the interior is redone to give it a more classic Georgian look. And all the furniture is replaced, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute broadly. Now here I have to stop before I go into this and say a few things about how did people look at the world in 1920, and why did they look at it that way? Between 1880 and 1920, there was increasing angst in the United States about these alien influences. Sounds familiar. And this begins, I say, in the 1880s, it begins with a thing called the Blaine Amendment. James G. Blaine was Secretary of State and Senator from Maine, and he proposed that the federal Constitution be amended so that federal money could never be used in a church-supported school. Now, this sounds like a great liberal idea, right? No, it was anti-immigrant, full stop. The whole thing was these immigrants come over here, especially those Irish ones, and they go to those Catholic schools. And that's an alien influence. That's what that's all about, okay? And about 20 states say, we think that's a great idea. We're going to amend our state constitution, and a number of states, including Pennsylvania, have a Blaine Amendment. This is pure nativism. Pure nativism. Now we get to around 1900, and the big wave of Irish and German immigrants is sort of coming to an end, okay? And we're getting more people from Eastern Europe and Italy. So that by about 1920, the vast majority of immigrants coming are from Eastern Europe and Italy. Oh, man, the Irish were bad enough. What about those guys? You know, because a lot of very prominent people, Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, were advocating changes to the immigration laws. Now, there's an excellent book that I'm just going to tell you about that you should probably read if you're interested. It's called The Guarded Gate by David Auckland, and it came out in the last 2 years, and it goes into this in detail. Because what you're leading up to is a major change in U.S. immigration law in 1924. A quota system is established, limits immigration, and bases it on the population of the United States in 1890, not even 1920. So what national origin are you? I'm Irish, I'm German, I'm whatever. Okay, but that's based on 1990, or 1890, and the 1890 demographics of the U.S. are very different than they were in 1920, because most of the people coming in were from Eastern Europe and Italy. Now, Eastern Europe particularly becomes hot because you have the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and waves of people trying to get away and come here. So they're all going really pretty hot about this. Now, you also have to remember, Woodrow Wilson is always seen as this great progressive. And on economic policy, he may have been. He was not on social issues. He is the one who integrated the federal service, he's the first Southern president, so he brings about segregation in the federal service. He brings in, during the First World War, the Department of War wasn't sure that Jewish people would really be smart enough in the military. That's a fact. After the war, the Palmer raids occurred. Mitchell Palmer is the Attorney General of the United States, and these big raids occur across the United States on so-called left-wing influences. And they arrest them and anything that looked alien to them. And of course, there were a lot of people coming in and so forth. And then you have to look at, those communists. Who were the Marxists? Well, a lot of them were Jewish intellectuals, so this makes it worse. These guys are all going nuts. By 1920, you all think of the Ku Klux Klan as being essentially down in the South, chasing after black people. In the 1920s, they marched in Niles, Ohio, and they were upset about having a lot of Catholic immigrants around. They controlled the Republican Party in Indiana. And there's a very funny story. In 1925, the Klan decided to have its national convention in South Bend, Indiana. Now, how many of you, if you think of South Bend, Indiana, I'm sure if you think 1925, you're not thinking Pete Buttigieg. You know that Notre Dame is there. Okay? And so what is Notre Dame? Bunch of Catholics, right? So the Klan is having a convention in South Bend, all running around in sheets. The students take off to town and they mug anybody that they see in sheets. True. And that's a story in itself. There is a book called Notre Dame and the Klan. It's very funny in many ways. With the benefit of hindsight, it's funny, of course. And there's a lot of other stories about that we could go on about. But that's the temper of the times in terms of how people saw the world. They were concerned with these alien influences. The classic example to me, I think of, is J.P. Morgan Sr. would dine with the elite German Jewish bankers of New York, Lehman, Goldman. He would deal with them. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., thought they were all alien. He didn't want any Catholics or Jews on the board at Harvard. Yep.
I found it fascinating when Hugo Black died recently, and he was part of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes.
A prominent member of the Ku Klux Klan.
That's right.
Before he was elected to the Supreme Court.
Yes, that is correct.
Appointed.
That's right. He was elected as
And
senator from Alabama, right.
And he was a very well-respected member of the Supreme Court. But his roots go back to being in white sheets.
That's right.
I mean, it just actually boggled my mind.
Well, Robert
Because
Byrd...
when in law school, I remember reading his opinions, and they're very well thought out, they're very respected, they're not prejudiced or anything like that. And it just...
Well, I guess we can only refer that there's hope for all of us.
Almost all.
Yeah, but we'll see. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to tell you, my father ran for councilman in Shaker in the late 1930s. He was a doctor, but he was Irish, he was Catholic, and the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross on his yard on Alabama.
Really?
Now, what is this?
Well, that's interesting. So now let's go back. Let's go back to the era of the 1920s and what these deed restrictions are really about. Okay, the deed restrictions often have this great negative connotation because people immediately think of restrictions on different racial or religious groups. But they're really about zoning. Because if you read the deed restrictions, they tell you things you can't do. They tell you what the setbacks have to be. They lay out what Shaker Heights is. The thing I love is prohibited livestock. Now this is kind of funny because remember, Shaker Heights, Beechwood, and Pepper Pike all have the same deed restrictions. Some years ago, since in the evolution of thing, Beechwood became one of the most Jewish cities in the world. I think it's like 90% or something. And some years ago, a group of what are called modern Orthodox asked if the deed restriction could be changed. Why can't we have livestock? We are Orthodox. We want to have our own chickens. Now, if you grew up in Shaker Heights the night when I did, and somebody says they want chickens, get these people out of here. Chickens? Are you kidding? You couldn't even have horses for the most part in Shaker Heights. There's no stables. Do you ever see a country estate here with a stable in the back? No. If you wanted to ride, you went down to the riding club where the help me, Jack. The skating club is, yeah, because that originally was part of the National Guard Armory, which had horses. My father used to ride from there back in the 30s. So remember, the Vans control everything. But there's one thing to remember. There is nothing in a Van Sweringen deed that says no Jews, no blacks. And everything I want to say here now is only about the known practices of the Van Sweringen Company. There's a lot of other stuff that went along on the side that is not acceptable and may arguably been inspired by what people perceived to be what the Vans believed. However, let's go through what happens here. In 1925, how do we get this Van Sweringen consent in 1927? That's kind of late in the game. Why is that there then? So that my father buying a house in 1930 is saying, oh, they told me I can't sell my house without their permission. Well, in 1925, the Vans controlled everything, but the thing they did not control was resale. In 1925, somebody sold a house on Huntington to a black doctor. Now, there were 2 black doctors on the faculty staff of University Hospital in the 1920s. The one had bought a house in Wade Park, not far from the hospital. Nobody cared. It was in a primarily white neighborhood. Nobody cared. This guy comes to Shaker Heights. Ooh, the troops are up in arms. The neighbors are unhappy. A couple other things are happening. And I'm saying this in the context of, remember what I told you about people's angst. Now, in the 1920s, the Great Migration north from the south had kind of just begun. So Cleveland had a relatively small black population in those days. So there aren't really a lot of blacks in the city as a whole. But this doctor buys this house. People are all up in arms. How many of you were at the event last night out there by Pinstripes? All right, there's another piece to the story. You ever hear of Woodmere Village? Okay. Woodmere is a funny little place. It's a small little village, and you could say, where the hell did that place come from? Why is that there? Because somebody wanted to sell property to the Vans at a high price. And OP said, I don't need it. I don't want it, and I'm not paying your price. What does he do? He breaks the place up, and he sells it primarily to black buyers. And from the 1920s onward, the majority of residents of Woodmere were black. And that's why. So OP's already thought he's been taken to the cleaners once by somebody. And he remembered that. Then he sees this. He says, wait, hey, look, we got to control this. This can't happen. Because the neighbors are all upset. I don't need this. Put the police outside the house and make it impossible for these people to stay. So anybody who went in or out of the house was searched. Well, you know, how long do you put up with that? You sell and you move. Then the Vans, OP says, we got to have a solution. That's where the Van Sweringen consent comes in. And the Van Sweringen consent just basically says, you can't sell this property to another buyer without our permission or the 5 adjacent property owners in the event that the Van Sweringen company no longer exists. All right? So that comes along in 27. The Shaker Protective Society is formed. This is headed up by one Newton D. Baker, the great progressive mayor of Cleveland, the founder of Baker, Hustetler, and Patterson. You get this notice. It's in your best interest. Change the deed. And 90% of the deeds at the time were changed. So that virtually almost every house in Shaker Heights today has this in the deeds. Now, an important thing is to remember, in 1947-48, a very important Supreme Court came out, Shelley versus Kramer. And Shelley versus Kramer comes out of St. Louis, and there were deed restrictions that said you cannot sell your house to blacks. Somebody sells their house to a black, and one of the neighbors say, no, you aren't. You can't under the deed. He goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically says all deed restrictions that prohibit based on religion or race are nullified. Unconstitutional. Has no effect on the Van Sweringen consent because the language does not say that. Now, as late as when my mother sold her house in 1981, the Van Sweringen consent was still in force because the mayors of Shaker Heights, Beechwood, and Pepper Pike became the trustees of the Van Sweringen Company after the Depression. And therefore, what did they do? They always said yes. You could have sold it to a church mouse and they would have said yes, okay? And they did, and they collected a $10 fee for it, for their trouble. So every time a house was sold, whoops, okay, sell it, it's fine. We don't care. Give us $20 for this. And as far as that was going on into the 80s, I don't know if they still do that, but I know that there's always been, these deed restrictions are the foundation of zoning here. End of discussion. Very, very important thing. Yes.
What about lending institutions?
Oh, well, that's. Let me just say. My comments were strictly about what was Van Sweringen Company practice. There's a lot of stuff outside of this realm, in the private sector, informally or otherwise. I've often said to people, if you lived in Shaker Heights when I lived there, you could have too many vowels or too many consonants in your last name, and people might not speak to you. I can think of cases like that. What's your name? Oh. They're not our kind of people. I mean, that was there. Am I proud of this? No. I'm just saying that that's the world the way it was. And therefore there was an awful lot of informal stuff that's ugly and unpleasant.
My mother signed, when she got a loan from Shaker Savings,
Yeah,
she would not sell to.
that's possible.
Fill in the blank.
That could be, that could be. I have heard stories of deals in mortgage situation that would say you couldn't sell to this, or you had to sign a statement that you weren't Jewish. But those weren't Van Sweringen Company's requirements, and for reasons that you will see shortly, you can't really put that directly on them. It may have been derived by the way people perceived their outlook. Because, oh dear, I did something here. I need to move that back.
The whole table.
Oops.
The table.
Oh, I see. All right. Yep. There you go. Good. Now, here's the thing I want to make, because this is the two major points that are clearly seen in Van Sweringen Company practice. If you had the money and were well connected, you were in. And we'll see a number of houses that were owned by prominent Jewish families in the 20s that like Mark Grossman. That's not why I picked Mark Grossman's house. It's pure garden movement. And it's totally inspired by Lutyens and Jekyll. But, here's a prominent member of the Cleveland Jewish community. You want to buy a house? Boom. And it's on one of the most prominent locations in the city. The other thing that is true, though, there never was a major Jewish institution invited to be in Shaker Heights. If you follow the evolution of where Jews lived in Cleveland, they come up from central area down up to, from Central Avenue to Glenville, up to Superior to Mayfield to Cleveland Heights. And at the top of that, you have, in the next generation, Temple on the Heights, Park Synagogue, and so forth. Those are all there. Oakwood Country Club, and Hebrew Academy, all of that filtered right up the hill, and nobody stopped it. But of course, you see, there was Cleveland Heights has many developers, not one. Shaker Heights has one developer. They decide it all. So, yeah, you got money, you're welcome. Mr. Grossman, fine. Mr. Horowitz, great. But something I forgot to add here is Shakerville, Moreland, where we are. This was originally Eastview Village, and everything south of Chagrin is kind of like Mount Pleasant bungalows, for the most part. They're frame houses. They certainly don't fit your perception of a house in Shaker Heights. Those properties, the Vans see that, and they say, we must control who is coming in there. And only in Eastview Village, or Moreland, did you ever have two really small Orthodox Jewish synagogues. There used to be one on Lee Road, and I think another one over on Ludgate and Chagrin. Now the funny part is, and this Chris, if you're my age, you remember that Chagrin had the name of Kinsman. Well, then the city fathers decided in the mid-1950s, well, we can't have this thing called Kinsman. They'll think about those areas in Cleveland that are on Kinsman. So they changed the name. I'm surprised somebody doesn't say we really need to change it back to Kinsman to be historically correct. That'll be the next politically correct thing to do. Let's change the name. Okay. So the Vans get control of Eastview with the hopes, let's control everything that happens after this. We'll make them like us. Whatever. Now, this is really more the fun part, the houses. And this is my favorite thing. A friend of mine's mother years ago called Winslow Diaper Alley. Because so many people came to Shaker Heights as newlyweds. And they went into a two-family, hence this Diaper Alley bit, and they have 2 or 3 kids and whatever, and the daddy makes more money, and they move north. Fernway, Malvern, wherever. And I know a number of you, your families were either on the south of the border, and then you moved north of Van Aken. Somebody once said to me years ago, you never spoke to me. I didn't. No, you were one of those people who lived north of Van Aken. You thought we were inferior. And I said, well, if you say so. I sort of, all I can remember is I'd gone to her father's funeral, and all I could think of is, well, I guess you forgot I went to your father's funeral. But anyhow, it must have been something else I did or said. Maybe I never asked her out. That may have been the problem. So, Diaper Alley to a historic district. Now, this is sort of classic for two reasons. This is now the rectory of St. Dominic's Church, but it's your classic two-family house. It's on a corner. It's a duplex. Has one front door, and you go inside, and there's a spiral staircase that takes you to the second floor. And the second floor and the first floor are identical. But to somebody driving by, they would just, who didn't know, they would think, oh, this is a very large house. Okay? Because the vision for two-family houses always was two families, one door. You don't see the stuff that you see, the up and down, two families that are very common in Cleveland, in Mount Pleasant areas and other sections of Cleveland. You never see that. Forget that. We're not going to allow that. Well, you do see some of that, yeah, because you see that's where you get that Mount Pleasant look that comes in with these bungalows that you're talking about. That's true. This is classic, Here you got, one door, two families, and of course the second floor is where the owner lives because he has this cathedral ceiling. Now, something to remember about this thing. The Vans had borrowed a lot of money, so they got to start selling, have areas with high density, and sell it off so that we can make the economics work. So we got to sell properties and get density. And that also helps the Van Aken line from a rapid point of view, okay? So density of population, remember, south of Van Aken, there are 4 school districts. The other 5 are north of Van Aken. So huge differences in the density of the populations. But that's very typical. The other thing is that in the 1920s, mortgages had like an 8-year life. There was no such thing as a 30-year amortizing mortgage. That's a post-World War II thing because of what happened in the Depression. That didn't exist. You had 8-year bullet mortgages, meaning that after 8 years, you better come up with the cookies or be able to refinance or bye-bye. And that proved to be a real disaster in the Depression because people's incomes were down, they couldn't sell the house, they lost it, etc. So this is very typical. The two-family house, and you rent to somebody and they help pay the mortgage. In some cases, the family. I remember hearing people who, their parents lived upstairs and their grandmother lived downstairs, that type of thing. Now you end up with the kinds of things the Vans did. This is infrastructure. This is the Linfield Station. There used to be 4 of the similar type things. One at Cortland, one at Coventry, one at Shaker Square, and this one. And this at one time was the end of the line before it was extended in the 30s out to Warrensville Center Road. The other thing to sort of think about is doors. Somebody's got to do a poster or a calendar of doors. There's so many doors in Shaker Heights you should take a picture of. Because there's so many, my wife when we lived here used to say, you cannot drive the car when we're in Shaker Heights. Why? Because you're always looking at people's houses. You're going to drive us into a tree. It's probably still true. So this house is a George Burroughs house on Shaker Boulevard just above Belvoir. And this is a house on, I believe, Normandy, designed by Nichols and Fritchie. These are a lot of the major architects, and the ones that we're going to spend a lot of time, we'll talk about Small and Rowley. They're very important in the period 1921 to 28 because they impose standards. It's not reflected necessarily in the number of houses they did, but they basically wrote the Van Sweringen Company standards that are in a book in 1924. And they have quaint things like, you may not use zinc in leaded glass windows because zinc is cheap and flashy. Exact quote. Then you have a variety of Bloodgood Tuttle is one of those architects who does a lot of demo houses. He built 37 in Shaker, or designed 37, 11 for the Vans, and 8 of them are on Van Aken. And my good friend over here used to live in one on Coventry. You have another big name here is George Burroughs. Nobody built more houses than George Burroughs and his associates over a 40-year period. I would personally express that George Burroughs runs from the great to the extreme mediocre in terms of architectural style. And I lived next door to one that was built in 1950 that is extreme mediocre style. Hence my view. But there's a lot of his houses that are really great and others that are just, let's whip them out for Gunderson and build a house.
So the Moreland houses were built by one person?
The ones that I referred to before, I don't really remember. I know that they're all by him on what's that street you lived on? Westby, what street did you live on?
Westbury.
Westbury. They're all on Westbury. And they're all two families. They're brick, two families, up and down.
I'd just like to say, my father-in-law is 104.
Yeah.
He graduated from Shaker in 1933.
Oh my
He
God.
lived on Shelton in a house that his father built.
Yeah, that could very well be. Yeah, very definitely. But that's one of those, that Eastview Village area. Then you have Fox and Duthie, who did 8 model houses on Scottsdale in 1928. The plain dealer encouraged them, why don't you show us what you could do that a house could be bought for the princely sum of $15,000. And they're all 8 different styles on Scottsdale. You have Chester Lowe, who did 178 houses. And this is interesting. Between 21 and 23, Tramer Realty, which was owned by a Mr. Roseman, he had 2 companies, Fairfax Construction and Tramer Realty. Roseman would build houses as Fairfax Construction, sell them, and then a lot of times he'd refinance them on his own nickel through Tramer Realty. There's 45 houses in a 3-year period. They're almost all in Fernway. And you can say, well, why would they allow somebody to buy 45 lots? Easy, they owe a lot of money. So somebody wants to come along and buy 45 lots, great. They cannot look alike. And and that means you had to vary what they looked like. Once you know them, they all look alike in a sense, because they have a very identifiable frame or shingle style. And they're very, not hard to figure out which ones they are once you've seen a few of their houses. And then Keith Truhoff, over about a 40-year period, built 122 houses. Now, I'm going to digress a little bit on personally, because this story is about my parents, but this story was repeated hundreds and hundreds of times between the 1920s and the 1950s, at least. So here this handsome couple are in 1927 when they're married. When they're married, they move to the Sovereign Hotel and live in their first year. And then they move to this house on Avalon in 1928. And this is Fox, Duthie, and Foose, the firm I just mentioned, Fox and Duthie. This is the house. This is just on Avalon, just before you get to Chagrin, across from the, well, I want to say Danny Boots, and I date myself. But in any event, whatever is there now is where it is. And so from there, you know, okay, my father says, okay, well, this is perfect. We're now in Shaker Heights. Now we got to build a house. This is what they did in 1930 on Dorchester. This house is designed by Nichols and Fritchie. Nichols, the partnership broke up in the mid-30s because Fritchie came from a fairly wealthy Cleveland family, but he was very smart to realize designing houses for the affluent has no future in the 1930s. What else can I do? He goes out to California and he gets on board as an investor in a company called Technicolor Inc. Just as everybody's making color movies. So he made his fortune in the movies, not designing houses. But he was a very good friend of my parents, and he designed, this house has 3 versions. The first house is bigger, but it's 1930. And you know, my father is looking at the newspaper every day, and the stock market is doing, you know, and he said, you know, I mean, maybe we ought to build a smaller house. So version 2 comes in. And version 2 is really a stripped-down house. My mother does not like this house. And my father was a very wise man. Remember that adage, happy wife, happy life?
Yes.
He observed it for 55 years. Okay? So they did a 3rd version. And that house has, this house on the interior has a lot of interior features, crown moldings, paneling, and true to the era, a hidden panel in the living room to hide the booze. A lot of houses in Shaker Heights have a place where you can hide the booze. Now, in some cases, it's a room. Sometimes it's hidden drawers. In our house, it's a panel in the living room, and you pushed it, and there's these 2 shelves, and you could easily have gotten 12 bottles of scotch in there. When I was a child, that had all moved to the basement. We no longer did that. This is a Nichols and Fritchie house on Shaker Boulevard. Gives you a good idea of the quality of their work. This one is on Belvoir. Please notice the tapestry brick, and the brickwork in the chimney. This, you know, you don't see this anymore. Now, this doesn't happen. You didn't see it after the Second World War, as we'll see. This is a design for one of their houses that, as far as I know, was never built. Okay, no, this house was never built, but it's classic of the period in terms of the kind of work that they did. I love this house for 2 reasons. One is, what do you do with a corner in Shaker Heights, in Fernway or Malvern, when these streets wind around and don't come to 90-degree angles? They don't. So you end up with these funny corners. And that means that in the Fernway area, you put a duplex on it. And there's a door on Fernway, or a door on Avalon, and there's a door on Dorchester, or however you want to play them. Lots of those around. But this house is at the corner of Eaton and Oxford. So what he did is he places the house on the corner. It's got an Eaton address, but it really doesn't face either street. But more importantly, I believe you asked me about, where did I get that drawing? Somebody asked me about that. Yep. See the drawing? Same source. Look at the arches on that house. Look at that house. This is almost like, you know, right out of the brochure. The idealized brochure shows these castles in the clouds. That's it. This house is next to our house. It's a Chester Low house built in 28. And in 1936, it was finally sold to the man who was general manager of the A&P for the Ohio region, a guy named D.F. Meyer. And D.F. Meyer lived there for 40 years. Ladies, you may want to know, Mrs. Meyer never cooked a meal in 50 years. They first had a full-time cook, and at some point after the war, they started going out to dinner every night except for Christmas and Easter, and they went to Stouffer's every night. It was like clockwork. He'd get home at 6 o'clock, the Cadillac would come down at 6:30, and they'd be home for 8:30. And if you went to Stouffer's, which we did many times, they would always be there. This is a fun house because I have the good fortune of having the interior of the house from the 30s. This is a Monroe Copper house on Daleford. It was once owned by Dr. and Mrs. Petznick in the 40s and 50s. I believe the story is her parents were given the house by, or Dr. and Mrs. Petznick got the house as a gift from Mrs. Petznick's parents. Then you have what it looks like in 1936. You know, the interior. I remember this dining room. I was quite taken by this when I was a kid. This crystal chandeliers, the English furniture, this very fancy silver wallpaper with Chinese designs. You know, I was in this house a number of times, and I never forgot what that dining room looked like. And there was this beautiful rose garden outside that bay window. I don't know if that's still there or not. Corner house at the corner of Linton. 2-family. Put it on the corner. Looks like one big house. This picture was taken in 1975. The then owner, the place was impeccable. You know, some landscape service came. There wasn't one blade of grass higher than any other. It was absolutely impeccably kept. Not quite so much today. This is a Bloodgood Tuttle demo house on Van Aken. They're very easy to identify once you see them, because in the old days they all had casement windows. Rather than leaded windows. The casement is a curse because they rust. Any of you who have ever been in a Bloodgood Tuttle house will know that you have probably replaced the windows. Now there is his house again. This is Van Aken. See that one? That's Kingsley. They plagiarize. You know, there isn't a lot of originality here. If you like Jack Bialowski's kind of architecture, which I'll defer to you as your preference, you don't get that with these guys. They are not originators. They are superlative at executing classical forms and copying. Now this house, I think, is quintessential Shaker Heights. Why? Because if you're coming up North Park and you cut by the Nature Center, this is the house you see. And this was built in 1922 as the residence of George Guy Grant Peckham. We lived next door when my wife and I were married, in the house next door. We were the tenants of John and Dorothy Pegg. And John and Dorothy Pegg are the first full-time black residents of Shaker Heights. They bought a house in Ludlow in 1959. There was an incident, a bomb as I recall, and this led to the forming of the Ludlow organization and the Lomond Association, and they then moved to South Park, and when we were newlyweds they had a carriage house and we rented it from them. And Dorothy lived to be 104 and was still going to meetings of the Cleveland Institute of Music 2 weeks before she died. Phyllis Peckham lived here 60 years. Now, who was G.G.G. Peckham? He was the Ohio Buick man. He made 2 GM fortunes. He was one of the founders of Delco. He sold that to GM at the end of World War II, or World War I rather. Then he gets the franchise for Buick. And he sells that to them in the late 20s. Because by the late 20s, GM decides, we don't want any more of these distributors. We're going to buy out all the distributors, and we're going to form a company called GMAC that will do all the dealer finance. And that gave them complete control of the supply chain. And so they lived there quite comfortably for many, many years. The interior of the house is interesting because in Phyllis's time, the interior had all been done by a firm called Roymer Brooks. Now here again is where we get some interesting raps. Who were really close associates of the Vans? Well, Small and Rowley, the architects from 21 to 28. You have Louis Roymer of Roymer Brooks. Now he's Jewish, okay? So, the Vans paid him millions because he got every major decorating contract that anything the Vans did, notably the South Park House and Roundwood and the Greenbrier Suite. Made a lot of money. He also did all the stuff for the carriage trade. And his protege was Ray Warren Irvin, who then becomes, after Louis Roymer dies in 36, it later becomes Irvin and Company. His son, James Roymer, is Monuments Man. After he goes off to Andover and Harvard, goes to work at the Met. His first assignment is, will you please build the cloisters to satisfy the Rockefellers? Then he goes to the Second World War and he gets involved with recovery of looted art, and hence the movie Monuments Man. I put this in, I had to. It's nothing to do with Shaker Heights. I just hope that, I knew Phyllis Peckham very well. She's gone to her reward. I always hoped that she had this car. A 35 Buick convertible, it's a roadster with a rumble seat, and then it has a proper trunk. Those proper trunks fitted on a rack, and then in the interior, they had a complete set of luggage that were fitted in to match. The Packards of that era always had. But this was about $1,200 in 1935. A Ford is like $550. Put it in connection. A Sweringen residence on South Park. Now this is kind of a funny house in a way. Where did the Vans? The Vans lived in this house. Now they had a house. This house is a massive revision of the 1912 house. Some architect whose name I forget. It is without doubt, I thought, the ugliest house I've ever seen. I saw pictures of it, and I said, how can that be that house? And then I discovered these big boulders, massive thing with red tile roofs. It's really ugly. There's a number of them in that era, what I call, that's the Shaker Heights Fortress era. You know, they look more like they should be, you know, on the Rhine or something, defending against the hordes or something. It's huge places. But then they build this. They discover in 1924 that the place is really ugly. You really have to redo it. They spent $300,000 to redo that house in 1924. Okay? And so you have this slate roof, everything, and then what you have is all the rooms line up like a railroad car. You got a dining room, a morning room, a library, a living room, and an end room. And then there's a hallway that runs across the back of the house. But the good news is, you know how sometimes you get into these old massive houses in Shaker and they're always dark? This one isn't. because it has windows all the way on both sides,
You also
going
have a
through the
cross
house.
breeze.
Huh?
You also have a cross breeze, which you wouldn't have if you put multiple rooms back to back.
That's right, that's right. You get what they used to call cross ventilation before people had air conditioning. The paneling is superb. It's the same paneling that you'll see in the Greenbrier Suite and in the old oak room down at the terminal. 300-year-old oak. It's magnificent. Supposedly it came from Sherwood Forest. I think that's largely an apocryphal story. But you know, it makes it all sound good when you make these magical pieces to the store. Now, Small and Rowley are interesting to look at because they're both born in Springfield, Ohio, about the same age. They both go to MIT, and they come to Cleveland and form a partnership in 1921. Small has married a fairly wealthy Cleveland girl, so he's got a little backup to what he wants to do. Rowley lives here. He buys this house in 1921 and lives there till 1976. He never designed this house, and he never made it fancy. I was in it a number of times. In 1976, it had 4 bedrooms and 1.5 baths. Very down-to-earth guy, very practical. That's important. Now, Small lives here for a few years, and then he moves to Kingsley in about like 28 or 29, something like that, and that becomes his final house. This is another Small and Rowley house. Now, you look at Small and Rowley houses to get what do Van Sweringen standards look like in the real world. This is what it's supposed to look like, okay? You get English Tudor, you get Colonial, and you may get a little bit of French, because those are kind of like the 3 preferred styles, okay? Now, this is Morley Road. And this is an interesting road because it just gets completely shaped by what they do on this street in the 20s. You see those 2 houses? On first glance, you think they look alike. They don't. Okay? They have a similarity, but they're not the same house. This is on the left, tapestry brick, door on the left, and you'll notice the arches on the door and the window. Go to this house in reverse. No tapestry brick here, and different archway over the door. Now, in the interior of the 2 houses, they basically are the same, except in reverse, because the door on one is on the left and the other on the right. But that's what they did. So you're an architect coming next to these 2 guys who are the favorite architects of the Vans. So what do you do? Oh, I'm sorry. That's Small and Rowley, Colonial. And then this guy comes along and he's building a house next to those other 2 brick houses. So what do? The safest thing to do is do what they do. That's it. See? But that continues throughout the area. This house is built in 1937. And actually, in some ways, it's better than what preceded. There's an interesting thing that as you get to the end of the Depression, there are a few houses that, like, people had a lot of money and costs were low. Because of depression, deflation, if you bought a house like my father did in 1930 and you paid $15,000 plus the lot to build it, you could have done the same thing in 1936 for probably half as much because of deflation. So somebody buys this house or builds this house, he's really getting more bang for his buck because of deflation in that period. Clarence Mack. A lot of people like Clarence Mack. He has about 40 houses in Cleveland, mostly on the west side, believe it or not, along Lake Avenue and Edgewater Drive. This is a house in Annapolis, Maryland. And remember what I said about how they copy? Clarence Mack frequently gets accused of really plagiarizing. So this is this house. Oh, you've seen that. South Park in Portland. This house was built and the residence of J.J. Burnett. Now, J.J. Burnett is another close Van Sweringen associate. He's hired to run the nickel plate in 1915. And then he becomes the guy who makes the nickel plate highly profitable, the Erie and the Chesapeake and Ohio. And his major achievement was, one of his things he did is, if those of you who are interested in old trains, the Berkshire engine is his baby to make the railroads. A very highly efficient steam engine It allows you to carry twice as many freight cars, uses less coal, et cetera, and therefore improves profitability. Now, again, we go back to, who do the Vans associate with? J.J. Burnett's a Catholic. He's brought in because he's the sharpest railroad guy in the country. And he runs the railroad. So somebody could think, well, the Vans are anti-Catholic. That's a problem. Because you got J.J. Burnett, who's a Catholic. You got John P. Murphy, who was a Notre Dame grad, who was the general counsel, and who ultimately ends up, along with Charles Bradley, owning the Higbee Company after everything falls apart in '37. And then you got J.J. Anzalone, who's kind of like the in-house controller. And these guys are all Catholic. And I guess, I don't think, all they cared about was performance. What's the color of your money? Can you deliver? Okay? This is what this is about. This is the same block, and they repeat the same thing. His houses are really pleasing to the eye, but when you look at them, you see how much he copies or repeats. Here's George Burroughs, and in fairness, this is George Burroughs at his best. Okay, he's brilliant when he's great. This is on Sydenham, and there's like 7 or 8 Burroughs houses on Sydenham over a 50-year period, which is interesting. This is 1931. This is 1930. And I'll come back to him in a minute. This is Charles Schneider's house. Charles Schneider is a major architect. He did Fernway School, he did City Hall, he did the Cyberling Estate in Akron, and this is his personal residence in 1916. Now, this is a very unusual house. We talk sometimes about how the Vans have these very strict standards, and there's no exceptions. This is unusual. It's a 1.5-story house. There are no 1.5-story houses prior to World War II, except this one. He gets it. 1916. It's a magnificent house inside. Beautiful wood paneling. There's linen fold. If you know what I mean by linen fold paneling, it's in the living room and the library. Beautiful paneling in this house. This is my all-time favorite house. If I ever do win the lottery, I might buy it. I got to buy the ticket though, and that's the problem. Now we go back. This is Samuel Horowitz, 1929, cost $50,000. The Horowitzes are one of the most prominent Jewish families in Cleveland in 1929. So you have what's the color of your money? Welcome aboard. You're in. Same with Solomon Halley. The Halley Mansion overlooking Horseshoe Lake is arguably the biggest house in Shaker Heights, I think, in terms of square footage. And it's a magnificent sort of house. Again, a Jewish family in the 20s. Yeah.
Bigger than that, Sweringen?
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, but no. The Vans have this place called Roundwood out in Hunting Valley, which is the same size as the White House. And had to be the classic example of, my God, they must have believed that the streets were paved with gold.
The Halleys, my mother was a Halleys, that's why I was curious.
Yes. Oh, yeah, I'm sure you have. Yeah. Now this one is Charles Coleman, and Charles Coleman is an interesting architect. Charles Coleman was born Coleman Schwarzenberg, went to Cornell in 1912, and then sometime during World War I, his father had an unpleasant experience coming back into the United States on the eve of World War II, or American entry in World War I, and they decided they should change their name to Coleman, because they didn't want to be attainted with being German, albeit they were German and Jewish.
Isn't this Judy's grandfather?
That's correct.
Actually, my grandfather changed his name in World War I.
Yeah, that's what I said.
World War II.
No, I misspoke. Yeah.
He changed his name in World War I.
And then he proceeds to design 26 houses in Shaker Heights. Most of his clientele were Jewish. The Farbers were in the textile industry. This is next to the Horowitz house. And the one thing that I find, he sticks to classic forms, but he lightens them up. This has an English Tudor look, but it doesn't have that kind of heavy look that a lot of English Tudors can have. So it's a lighter house, and likewise, there's this beautiful archway to the right, and you go in under the archway to the garage. Now, also remember, just when I started talking about garages, there was sort of an unwritten rule in Shaker Heights before the Second World War. Thou shalt not see the garage. And I used to wonder, gee, why were they so anti-garage? Easy. A garage is essentially a high-class stable in their minds. We don't want to see the garage. So in a lot of houses in Shaker Heights, you go up the driveway and you turn to the right or the left, and the garage is behind the house. We do not wish to see the garage. That changes after the Second World War, massively. This is the Sam Cleaner residence on Montgomery, 1929. Again, Charles Coleman. Not as heavy, and the current owners, I think, probably get some credit for this because rather than using brown paint, they've used a much lighter beige to give it a kind of lighter quality. Morton Stone's residence on Falmouth, French style, but has a certain lightness to it that I personally find very attractive. And then this is the Alex Miller residence. They owned the Columbia Metal Company. And I think their son died a few years ago. He too, like the father, they were very active in the support of Jewish charities. And again, I mean, look, the house, it's lighter looking. It doesn't have this ponderous look as some of the Meade and Hamilton houses do that are built before 1920. The fortress period is what I call it. Now this is Sidney Amster, 1936. I don't have a picture of the house because you can't see it. It's in the trees. You know, a lot of houses in Shaker Heights in the last 50 years, the trees grow up and you just can't see it. You know, particularly the bigger the house. Yes?
This is on, I used to walk by the back of that house twice a day on the way to and from Shaker High School. It's now on, it's my favorite house of all time. It's now on the market for 1.7 million.
Yeah, I've seen that, yeah. And if you go online to see it, the rooms are magnificent. Beautiful paneling. They wouldn't let me in, I'm sure, because if I bought the house, the check would bounce. So that isn't going to happen. But it's a magnificent house. John Sherwood Kelly is kind of a later classical architect. You see a number of his houses, late 20s into the 30s. Amster, again, is a very prominent Jewish family in Cleveland. And Steve, tell me, where did the Amsters make their money? I know that Morris Amster came here from Hungary, and then Sidney moves here in the 30s. But I don't know where the money came from.
I'm not sure.
Okay. And they are buried in Glenville Cemetery, for those of you who are familiar with Jewish cemeteries in the city. John Sherwood Kelly on Chesterton. Oh, yeah, this is classic. This is all how Small and Rowley shaped what was going to happen. All you had to do is read the standards. Please do what you're told. We'll be happy. And they shaped this very classical style that is what people think of when they think of Shaker Heights. This is an Abram Garfield house built for David Ford. Abram Garfield is really an important architect. He doesn't do much in Shaker Heights because he's a little older by this point. He does work, though, for the great and the good. He's President Garfield's son. He was first in partnership with Meade, and it was Meade and Garfield. Then he leaves, and it becomes Meade and Hamilton. And he designed this house in 1929. He designed Livingston Ireland's house on North Park. But probably his most important property is the Bolton estate in Palms Beach. That property was built for Chester and Frances Bolton in 1915 when they were married. And it was sold after Mrs. Bolton died in the 70s. And lo and behold, in 2004, the house was sold for $70 million. And it was then the most expensive price that anyone had ever paid for a private residence in the United States. That has since been exceeded, of course. David Ford was one of the founders of Lubrizol. And for those of you who are old Clevelanders, his son Al Ford was Vice President of Finance at McCann's Mather. He was later Vice President of Finance at Diamond Shamrock and also at Standard Oil when it was owned by British Petroleum. So, you know, a lot of old Cleveland connections here. This looks out at University School. Now, this is where it gets fun. And if you could it's easy to talk about the grand and the glorious in Shaker Heights because it's easy to do. What's more interesting to do is look at the small and the beautiful. This house is on Shearington Road. This is a pineapple. This is leaded glass windows, tapestry brick. It's beautiful. And it doesn't get any better than that. You take all the classic elements. It's harder to do a little house well. It's easy to do a big house impressively. This, though, is so well done. It's hard not to really like it. That's been on my short list for 50 years of houses I wish I could own. Never will. Okay. Now, why do I show you this? Because now we want to talk a little bit about just after the Second World War. This architect here, H.W. Meyer, builds this house in 1950 for my father's cousin. They lived in Lomond before the Second World War. And after the Second World War, they had no children, so his wife needed a project, is what it really came down to. So what do you do when your wife needs a project? You build a house. They build this. Now, this I'm showing you is on Duffield because it shows a major shift that occurs after the Second World War. The biggest one is the stable to the left, okay? Because all the houses up there, you see the door, the garage. Suddenly, everybody wants a backyard. The garage gets moved to the front. But what's unique about this house is it still has superb detail. Look at the front door. You go in the house, I was in the house many times, beautiful wood paneling and mold, you know, the crown moldings, bay window overlooking the garden, and she had the most incredible taste in furniture. Anything Baker or Kittinger had, she could get at wholesale because he was in the furniture business, and she indulged that in that house. Magnificent. When she sold the house in 1970, or 62 rather, it was sold with the dining room set. And when it was on the market in 1975, it still had the dining room set. Why? Because I went in to see it, thinking, just out of fun, I didn't tell them who I was, but I wanted to see if the dining room set was still there. Beautiful house otherwise. But I would have to say that most of these houses in that area are not as well pulled off as this. By the mid-50s, the practicalities of design, economy, means you kind of see more of a development like. The houses look a lot more alike. And largely because the garage is always to the left or the right. And then you can see where everything else is. They really kind of follow. And I love it. Now here's George Burroughs again. This is again post-World War II. 1.5 story, you can see the garage, 1.5 story houses. You don't see it, most 1.5 story houses in Shaker Heights are east of Warrensville, and post-World War II. A lot of them. Green Road and South Woodland Road above Warrensville. Now we get to the end so you all can, get out of here. Somebody asked about the size of a house. I always think that Roundwood, which is out in Daisy Hill, is perhaps a symbol of why the Vans kind of lost touch with being grounded. Because you have this massive house that looks like should be an inn at Williamsburg. And it was originally thought, well, we're going to build this big country club. And then suddenly they decided they would build it for themselves. And they paid Royer Brooks $1 million to do the interior. Hence my allusion to how much Royer made off of the Vans. There's an old adage in Cleveland that goes, and sadly it's too true. The Vans never should have gone east of Green or west of the Mississippi. And it's very true, because they all represent excess, going too far. You're not looking at realities. And you build this house in 1924-25. It's the size of the White House in terms of square footage, to sort of give you a sense of proportionality. And it's been in the market for years. I have an ad for 2005. Back then it was $7 million. Today it's about $4.5 million. It's always on the market. There aren't any buyers. It's too big. This is the idealized view of what Beechwood and Pepper Pike were supposed to look like. They were supposed to be Shaker Country Estates, which was 2.5 acres to 5 acres. Well, that isn't what happened after the war. It became classic suburbia of the post-World War II period. What the Vans should have been doing is to consolidate. They have all this empire, and you have all these railroads that need consolidating. Now, why did they buy all these railroads? Because in 1920, Congress passed a law, the Esch-Cummings Act, to rationalize the railroad systems, particularly in the East, because there were too many railroads, and they knew that half of them were basically broke. So you got to rationalize this and make sense out of it. So the Vans that own the nickel plate, they decide to buy the Erie, the C&O, and several others, and now they want to consolidate them into one system. But the problem is, they're control freaks. And why do I say that? Because every time they come up with a proposal, as they did in 26 or 28 for the Interstate Commerce Commission, they always end up with 51% voting control. Now, Alfred Smith, who was their protege at New York Central, had died in 24. And some people think if Alfred Smith had lived, they might have been done proposals that were financially more realistic, because the Interstate Commerce Commission thought that there was too much leverage in their structure and that they were given too much control, particularly in the case of the Chesapeake Railroad, whose minority shareholders they felt were not being given proper compensation. In 1930, they go off the rail and buy the Missouri Pacific Railroad. It makes absolutely no sense. If you're trying to rationalize the Eastern Railways, why would you buy something that's west of St. Louis? It didn't make sense. Now, they came up with an argument, but it isn't really all that plausible. They have to go borrow more money as a consequence. And this, I think, is the ultimate thing I've criticized them for. They did not listen to J.J. Burnett. This is the guy who's the best railroad executive in the country, and he says, do not do this. They do it. Okay. You're paid, you hire these people to tell you what to do. You don't listen. Well, we've always been able to get away with this stuff. We'll just do it one more time. And it's very true. If you have been pushing the envelope for years, you continue to believe you can push the envelope forever. So, in 30, they got to pay, but do this, and they can no longer go to public markets because of the Depression. So then they go to the Friendly House of Morgan in New York City. Okay. Now, my Friendly House of Morgan tended to be reeking with cynicism. They borrow $39 million from them, which is due in 1935. Because obviously the world's going to turn around by 1935. Franklin Roosevelt's God, he will save us all, right? No, that isn't what happened. So you get this money and it's due in May of 35. Well, in May of 35, by this point, M.J.Van is really dying slowly. He's burned out. He's drinking too much and he has a lot of cardiovascular issues. And this is sort of kind of hidden under the rug someplace, that people don't realize that MJ is really dying slowly. But there's this Cleveland guy named George Tomlinson who's in the shipping business and owned a radio station called WTAM, which I forget what it is now. It changed its call, its letters. Is there still a WTAM? Yeah. Oh, well, okay. That's what happens when you move away 40 years ago. You forget everything. So he's got connections, and his connection is his wife's brother-in-law, a guy named George Ball. Now, who's George Ball? The Ball Glassworks. Now, why is that interesting? Because it's the Depression. Now, what did people do in the Depression? They canned. So Ball's making more money than anybody. He's a wealthy man because people are canning. You know, the only reason my father stayed afloat in the Depression was the company he worked for sold socks and ties. Now, he made a lot of money in the 20s on both. Come the Depression, who buys ties? But you still buy socks. So they were buying lots of socks. We survived. So then he goes to see Ball, and they go and they do a deal. Ball will finance the whole thing, buy it away in bankruptcy from the House of Morgan, which happens in the autumn of 35. But here's the deal. Within 10 years, you have to pay off all the money you owe to people. And you owe $75 million. It all has to be paid off in 10 years. And in 10 years, you can buy it back from me at what I pay for it at the auction, which is $3.5 million, plus interest. Meanwhile, I'll let you run it and pay you $200,000 a year to do it. Wow, Donald Trump couldn't have done that. Okay? You know, this is the deal of deals. So they do it. But you know, life is unfair. MJ dies in November of 35, and OP dies the following December. So they're dead by the end of 36. The party's over. Now Ball is looking at, I own this thing called Mid-America Corporation. It controls all these railroads. I don't know what a railroad is. I got to get out of here. So he sells it off to Robert Young and Kirby's And Cyrus Eaton is off on the side, because Cyrus Eaton eventually comes in and gets control of the C&O Railway after the war. And these guys get control of it, and their goal is a thing called, the holding company was Allegheny Corporation, which is still around as a holding company doing various things. It's controlled by the Kirby family, and the Kirby family are one of these people who know how to make their fortune back every generation. I could give you about 4 or 5 things why the Kirbys are still billionaires. They're not moldy money. They keep reinventing themselves, and this was one of their deals. The Kirby fortune, by the way, was originally Woolworths, because up in Scranton they used to call them the Kirby stores. And then they sold out to F.W. Woolworth, and then they moved on to other things, including investor diversified services. Every generation has done something. So these guys get control of this, and they ultimately got control of the Missouri Pacific, which in due course they sell to the Union Pacific. They got their chestnuts out of the fire and made a lot of money. Interesting thing here is the C&O gets control of the B&O. The big 4 major railroads in the United States in the 1920s, you have the Van Sweringen system, which is nickel plate, Erie, and C&O. You have the B&O Railway, the Pennsy, and the New York Central. The New York Central and the Vans were closely associated on the same side. Their biggest enemy was the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was the biggest, most profitable railroad in the country, and did not want the railroads rationalized in the 20s. They didn't want more competition. They wanted less competition, all of whom were about to go broke, essentially, is from their point of view. Well, we know what happened to the Pennsylvania and the New York Central railroads in the 1960s. But the railroads eventually get merged. The interesting thing is, just as a final piece, in 1933-34, FDR had a friend in Boston named Raymond Prince, who was an investor banker that Roosevelt had known. And he said to Raymond Prince, "What can we do with the railroads? They're bust." And he comes up with a plan to essentially rationalize the railroads into 7 railroads, which is about where we are now. But in a typical government form, and this probably proves Churchill's adage, give the Americans a lot of time, they will try every other alternative and eventually do the right thing. And in the 1980s, they finally rationalized the railroads, having seen many of them go broke in the process. And that's kind of run out in that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story. And I hope I didn't take you too long. Thank you.
Joe,
Yes.
it's my understanding that Gates Mills Boulevard, Raynard Road were all designed and laid out and built in the late 20s.
That's exactly right.
And they were done by this Van Sweringen.
That's right. You now put your finger on the problem. They've got, not only do they have this bloody railroad that they don't need, they've now got huge amounts of debt and commitment to own all this property in Beechwood and Pepper Pike and lay out streets with a plan that maybe they'll have it fully developed by 1950. So you've got to carry all that debt. And now you've got those